I remember the first time I doubted Emma. It wasn't a grand revelation or some glaringly obvious clue. It was a quiet moment, almost mundane. I was reading in the living room late one night when her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, and her lips curled into a small smile before she quickly flipped the phone over. "It's just my sister," she said, standing and stretching in that effortless way she always did. "She needs to vent about her boyfriend. I'll give her a call upstairs." Her explanation was perfectly reasonable, but something about the way she avoided my gaze stuck with me. Doubt, like a seed, grows in fertile soil. It starts small, almost imperceptible, but once planted, it's hard to uproot. A week later, my nephew, Ryan, came to town. He was starting a new job at a tech firm and needed a place to crash while he got on his feet. Emma was the first to suggest we let him stay with us. "It's family," she said, flashing me a disarming smile. "We've got the space." It seemed harmless enough. Ryan was a bright, good-looking kid in his mid-20s, full of energy and charm. He was the kind of guy who could light up a room, and Emma seemed to enjoy having someone new around. She started cooking elaborate dinners, something she hadn't done in months, and her laugh, once reserved for my jokes, seemed to linger in conversations with him. At first, I chalked it up to coincidence. Emma was always a people person, and Ryan was family. But little things began to pile up. Emma started dressing up more, stylish outfits, a touch of makeup, and perfume I hadn't smelled in years. "I just feel like putting in a little effort," she said when I commented on it. "Is that a crime?" Ryan seemed unusually attentive to her, too. He laughed at all her jokes, even the ones I knew she recycled. They shared inside jokes over dinner, little quips that left me feeling like an outsider at my own table. Once, when I walked into the kitchen unexpectedly, they were huddled together over her phone, laughing. They quickly stepped apart when they noticed me, the air in the room suddenly tense. But I told myself I was overthinking. Paranoia can be a dangerous thing, and I didn't want to accuse Emma of something without proof. After all, she was my wife, the woman I'd loved for over a decade. Trust was supposed to be the foundation of our marriage. Then came the night that changed everything. Emma announced she'd be working late, attending a client dinner downtown. "Don't wait up," she said, kissing my cheek as she grabbed her purse. I watched her leave, my mind buzzing with unease. Around midnight, I got up to grab a glass of water. Standing at the window, I noticed something strange. Ryan's car was missing from the driveway. My first thought was that he'd gone out with friends, perfectly plausible for someone his age. But as the minutes turned into hours, the coincidences piled up, becoming harder to ignore. Sleep didn't come easy that night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, questions swirling in my mind. Was I being paranoid? Or was there something happening right under my nose? I told myself I needed more than a hunch before I could confront her, or him. The seed of doubt had taken root, and its branches were spreading fast. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the cracks in my world shattered completely. I'd left work early, the rare luxury of a cancelled meeting giving me an unexpected reprieve. As I pulled into the driveway, I noticed Emma's car parked where it always was. Next to it was Ryan's. Nothing about it seemed odd at first. Ryan worked remotely some days, and Emma had mentioned she'd be home catching up on some bookkeeping for her boutique. But as I stepped out of the car, I noticed something that gave me pause: Emma's laughter, muffled but unmistakable, drifting through the slightly open window. It was the kind of laugh I hadn't heard from her in months. Full, genuine, and unguarded, the way she used to laugh when we'd first started dating. I froze, my keys dangling from my fingers as the sound twisted something deep inside me. Maybe they were watching a comedy, I thought. Maybe I was imagining things. But curiosity, or maybe suspicion, propelled me forward. I approached the house quietly, as if instinctively knowing I didn't want to be heard. The front door opened with a soft click, and I stepped inside. The house was still except for that laughter, a haunting melody coming from upstairs. The living room was empty, the dining table untouched from breakfast. Everything looked normal, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I was intruding on something. My heart hammered in my chest as I climbed the stairs. Every step felt heavier than the last. By the time I reached the landing, I could hear their voices clearly, muffled by the door to the guest room. "You're too much," Emma said, her voice laced with playfulness I hadn't heard in a long time. "Come on," Ryan replied, his tone equally teasing. "You know you love it." I stood frozen, my mind a swirl of emotions, disbelief, anger, hurt. The door was slightly ajar, just enough for me to see inside. I leaned forward, my breath shallow, and peered through the crack. What I saw knocked the air from my lungs. Emma was there, tangled with Ryan on the guest bed. Her head was thrown back in laughter, her hair spilling over his chest as they lay close, their legs intertwined like vines. Ryan's hand rested on her hip, his thumb brushing her skin with a familiarity that turned my stomach. The sight was a dagger to the chest, each moment driving it deeper. This wasn't just a fling. There was comfort between them, an ease that came from time. It wasn't some spur-of-the-moment mistake, it was deliberate, intimate, and ongoing. For a moment, I couldn't move. My feet felt glued to the carpet, my mind unable to process what I was seeing. Emma, my wife, the woman I had built a life with, betraying me with my nephew, of all people. Ryan, who I'd welcomed into my home, who I'd treated like a younger brother, repaying my kindness with this. I felt a surge of anger rise, hot and blinding, but I forced myself to stay calm. Bursting in there, screaming, or fighting wouldn't change what I'd seen. If anything, it would give them the satisfaction of seeing me unravel. No, I wouldn't give them that. I turned and walked back downstairs, my steps deliberate, each one an anchor holding my rage in check. The door closed behind me with a soft thud, and I sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. The betrayal hit me in waves, each one harder than the last. I thought of every time Emma had smiled at me while lying through her teeth, every time Ryan had cracked a joke at the dinner table as if he hadn't been stealing from me behind my back. Part of me wanted to drive away and never come back. To leave them to their twisted little bubble and start fresh somewhere far away. But that wasn't who I was. I wasn't raised to run from a fight. My father always said, a man's strength isn't in his fists but in his ability to think under pressure. I leaned back in the driver's seat, staring up at the ceiling as I tried to steady my breathing. I couldn't confront them yet, not like this, not when my emotions were still raw. I needed a plan. Revenge, I decided, would be my solace. But not the kind that comes from yelling or throwing punches. No, revenge would come with patience, precision, and clarity. It would be cold, calculated, and final. They had made their choices, and now, I would make mine. As I started the car and pulled out of the driveway, I made a promise to myself. I wouldn't just confront them, I would dismantle them. Piece by piece, lie by lie, I would take back everything they had stolen from me. And when the dust settled, I would still be standing, while they were left to face the ruins of their betrayal. The morning after I saw them, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. I stared at the ceiling for a long time, letting the events of the previous day settle like sediment in a shaken glass. Anger flared now and then, but I pressed it down. Anger wouldn't help me. Focus would. Emma moved around the kitchen as if nothing had changed. She poured coffee, hummed along to some pop song on her phone, and even kissed me goodbye on her way to work. I wanted to ask her how it felt to lie so effortlessly, to carry on like the life we'd built meant nothing. Instead, I smiled and waved her off like the fool she thought I was. Once she was gone, I picked up my phone and dialed a number. A friend of mine, Rick, had a contact, a private investigator he swore by. "You want dirt? This guy digs deeper than a grave digger," Rick had once joked. At the time, I didn't think I'd ever need someone like that. Now, I couldn't call fast enough. By evening, the investigator had begun his work. 2 days later, he called me with an update. "You were right to suspect something," he said. "Your wife and nephew have been busy." The weight of his words pressed on my chest. He forwarded pictures of Emma and Ryan together, shopping, having lunch, even meeting at a motel that wasn't exactly discreet. There were text messages too, recovered from her cloud storage. Their tone was sickeningly casual. "Ryan, think he's suspicious?" Emma, "Nah, Matt's clueless. You've met him, he wouldn't see a red flag if it hit him in the face." Ryan, "You're lucky I'm here to keep you entertained." Winky face. Emma, "Trust me, you're the only thing keeping me sane right now. I love you, Ryan." Reading those words felt like being punched in the gut. "I love you." That's what she used to say to me. Now, she was spending my money, using my home, and lying to my face while whispering those same words to someone else, my own nephew. But if their arrogance stung, it also gave me the tools I needed. Emma was careless with her accounts, using the same weak password variations for everything. It didn't take long for me to access her emails, bank statements, and shared photos. What I found wasn't just proof of their affair, it was evidence of betrayal on a financial level too. Emma had been transferring money from our joint account into a separate one under her name. From there, she spent it on gifts for Ryan, hotel stays, and even a down payment on a car for him. Thousands of dollars, all while telling me we needed to tighten our budget. I sat with this information, the damning texts, and the photos, and began to plan. Confronting them too soon wouldn't satisfy me. I wanted them to feel the consequences, to watch their carefully constructed lies crumble. My opportunity came one evening when Ryan returned from wherever he spent his days avoiding real work. I waited for him in the garage, leaning against the hood of my car. He froze when he saw me, a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. "Hey, Uncle Matt," he said, his voice a little too casual. "What's up?" I didn't reply immediately, just stared at him until he started to fidget. "I know," I said finally, watching his face closely. The color drained from his cheeks. "Know what?" he asked, trying to play dumb. I stepped closer, lowering my voice. "I know about you and Emma. I know what you've been doing under my roof. And I'm giving you one chance to end this. Walk away now, and I won't destroy you." He dropped the duffel bag, his hands balling into fists. "You don't have anything," he spat, his voice shaking slightly. "And even if you did, what are you going to do? Blow up your own marriage just to get back at me? You wouldn't dare." I almost laughed at his bravado. The kid had no idea who he was dealing with. "Ryan," I said, stepping even closer, my voice cold and calm, "you're young, and I get that arrogance runs deep in the young. But let me give you a little advice, don't mistake kindness for weakness. I'm not bluffing. Walk away, and maybe you'll still have a chance to rebuild your life." He held my gaze for a long moment, trying to decide if I was serious. When he finally stormed past me into the house, I knew he thought he'd won. But Ryan had underestimated me. He didn't know the extent of what I had or how far I was willing to go. As I stood in the garage, listening to the door slam behind him, I felt a dark satisfaction settle over me. Emma and Ryan's time was running out, and they didn't even know it. The trap was set. All I had to do now was wait. I waited for the perfect moment, my patience stretched thin but steady. A week after my confrontation with Ryan, Emma casually mentioned she'd be working late again. "Big project," she said, grabbing her purse and heading out the door. She didn't even try to mask her lies anymore. I knew where she was going. They always used the same excuse, the same patterns. This time, though, I was ready. Over the weekend, I'd installed discrete cameras in the guest room. It had taken a lot of effort to act normal while Emma was home, but the thought of catching them red-handed made it worth every tenth second. The cameras were small, undetectable, and perfectly positioned. When Emma returned late that night, her hair tousled and her excuse barely plausible, I didn't say a word. Instead, I reviewed the footage. What I saw turned my stomach, but it also solidified my resolve. They were careless, laughing and joking as if the bed they were in wasn't inside my house. My house. With the evidence in hand, I took the first step. I filed for divorce the next morning. My lawyer, a sharp and unrelenting woman named Meredith, assured me we had a solid case. With what you've gathered, she said, flipping through the texts, bank statements, and footage, Emma doesn't stand a chance. But that wasn't enough for me. I wanted them to feel the weight of their betrayal, to experience the consequences of their selfishness in every corner of their lives. First, I sent an anonymous email to Emma's boss. The email contained a short, edited clip of the footage, showing just enough to imply impropriety without revealing too much. I attached a note. Do you want someone like this representing your company's brand? Within 2 days, Emma was called into a meeting and promptly let go. She came home that evening in tears, blaming the toxic culture at work. I nodded sympathetically, suppressing a smile as she ranted. She had no idea I'd orchestrated it. Ryan was next. I contacted his employer, a smaller tech firm, and sent them a different clip along with a list of moral clauses in their employee handbook. Ryan had always bragged about the company's strict standards, and I knew this would hit hard. A week later, he was let go too. I didn't stop there. I shared what I'd uncovered with key family members. Ryan's parents, my brother and sister-in-law, were devastated. How could he do this? My brother said when I showed him the proof. To you, of all people. The fallout was swift. Ryan's family cut ties, their disappointment too much to bear. He was no longer welcome at family gatherings or in any conversations. Even those who had tried to stay neutral couldn't ignore the evidence I'd laid out. On the legal front, the divorce proceedings moved like clockwork. Emma tried to play the victim, spinning stories about how I'd neglected her emotionally. But every claim she made crumbled under the weight of my evidence. Meredith tore through her arguments with surgical precision. Mrs. Martin, she said during one hearing, holding up a stack of financial records, can you explain why you withdrew over $15,000 from the joint account and funneled it into a private one? Emma stammered, her face pale. I was saving for a surprise trip for us. Meredith raised an eyebrow. Interesting. Because these receipts show purchases for men's clothing, concert tickets, and hotel rooms. Care to explain how those were for your husband? Emma's lawyer tried to salvage the situation, but it was hopeless. By the time the court made its ruling, she was left with nothing. No house, no alimony, no assets. Her reputation, both personally and professionally, was in ruins. As for Ryan, he packed up and moved out of town. The whispers and judgment were too much for him to handle, especially with no job or family to fall back on. He left behind a trail of burned bridges and shattered trust, his cocky demeanor replaced with quiet humiliation. When it was all over, I stood in the empty house and let the silence wash over me. I'd won, but it didn't feel like a victory. The betrayal still stung, and the memories of Emma and Ryan's deceit lingered like ghosts. But there was a quiet satisfaction in knowing they'd faced the consequences of their actions. They'd gambled with my trust and lost everything. I hadn't raised my voice, thrown punches, or stooped to their level. I let the truth do the work, and it was more devastating than any confrontation could have been. As I sat on the porch that evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I thought about what lay ahead. The house felt like mine again, but it would take time to rebuild, to find peace after the storm. Still, I knew one thing for sure, I had taken my life back. And neither Emma nor Ryan would ever forget it. Months later, I stood in the living room of my home, now stripped of the shadows of betrayal. The furniture was sparse. I donated most of it to charity, not wanting to keep anything that reminded me of the life I used to share with Emma. The walls were freshly painted, and the air carried the faint smell of new beginnings. It was quiet, almost too quiet, but I'd grown to appreciate the silence. It gave me space to think, to breathe, to process everything I'd been through. The pain of Emma's betrayal lingered like a dull ache, a wound that had scarred over but would always remind me of what I'd lost. But there was something else, too, a strange sense of triumph. Not the kind of triumph that came from winning a battle, but the kind that comes from reclaiming what was taken. My home was mine again. My life was mine again. And I'd ensured Emma and Ryan would never forget the consequences of their actions. Emma, I'd heard through mutual acquaintances, was struggling to find work. The scandal I'd exposed had followed her, and no company wanted to risk hiring someone with such a tainted reputation. She'd moved into a tiny apartment on the edge of town, far from the life of comfort she'd once enjoyed. Ryan, on the other hand, had disappeared completely. He'd left town shortly after losing his job, cutting ties with everyone who knew him. His parents, my own brother and sister-in-law, were still grappling with the shame of what he'd done. They tried to rebuild their relationship with me, apologizing profusely for his actions, but I could tell it weighed heavily on them. The fallout had been devastating for both of them, but I hadn't needed to stoop to their level to achieve it. All I did was let the truth come to light. They'd undone themselves with their lies and arrogance. Some nights, I'd sit on the porch and wonder if I could have done anything differently. Should I have confronted them earlier? Should I have been more forgiving? The questions lingered, but I always came back to the same conclusion: they had made their choices, and I had responded in kind. It wasn't just about revenge, it was about justice. Emma and Ryan had betrayed me in the worst possible way, not just as a husband but as a family member. They'd taken advantage of my trust, my home, and my love. And while I couldn't erase the hurt they caused, I could make sure they didn't walk away unscathed. Now, as I sit here writing this, I wonder, was it enough? Did I do the right thing by exposing their lies and ensuring they faced the consequences? Or could I have handled things differently, with more grace or compassion? I ask you, the reader, what would you have done in my shoes? Would you have sought revenge, or would you have chosen a different path?